But these sexual identities offer an escape from the guilt and shame that was instilled on the critical race theory narrative. And they offer an escape. So you get, in some cases, I talk to teachers that say, 40% of my white female students in middle school now identify as non-binary, queer, transgender, etc.
In a recent conversation between talk show host Dave Rubin and Chris Rufo, who's one of the leading proponents speaking out against critical race theory over the last couple of years, they were trying to figure out what was at the root of this influx LGBT transgender identity amongst some of our current youth. This was a very interesting conversation. I thought they made some excellent points. Check it out.
Can you talk about how this is connected to all of the gender stuff? So it's not just race stuff, because when you talk about the parents, I think the thing that lit the parents on fire, they were pissed to a degree about the race stuff. But to me, it was the gender ideology, and then the election of Youngkin in Virginia that lit that on fire. And then we'll talk a bit more about Disney and DeSantis, because you had something to do with that as well. But how the gender piece of this is connected oddly to the race piece of this.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you look back 50 years at left-wing ideology, once they abandoned the orthodox Marxist idea of class conflict. So the two great categories are, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, or the capitalist class and the working class. That stopped working by the mid-20th century, and left-wing intellectuals were looking for other soft spots, other lines of attack, and they settled on race and sex, or race and gender. And that was the new formulation. And so when we were dominating the debate on critical race theory in late 2020 and then really 2021, you saw the left retreat from these issues. All of a sudden, Robin DiAngelo was nowhere to be found. Ibram Kendi was, on the defensive. And then you saw this shift in the debate when those same teachers and districts that had been pushing critical race theory in 2021 started really doubling down on especially trans, non-binary, and queer identity formations as the new thing, the new trend, the new current thing with capital C and capital T.
When he spoke on how the CRT proponents were looking for soft spots to attack so they can basically dismantle many of the foundations here in our country, they looked at areas that were extremely sensitive and always volatile, and where they could always find allegiance. And when you look at the history of our country, of the United States, you'll see the slave trade, you'll see the Jim Crow laws, you'll see the ugly history of racism in our nation. So they know that that's a soft spot, an area that's easy to attack, because the general consensus, especially amongst the Black community, is that racism was prevalent in our society at one time, and it still is. And that's basically something that's indoctrinated, that we're indoctrinated into. As a young person, I can recall hearing at school amongst my Black friends, and my dad to a lesser degree, but he did make reference to how as a Black person, you would have to do 5 times as much work. I've heard that over and over again. I've heard that repeated so many times, whether it's in our entertainment, whether it's in listening to the radio, conversations on talk shows, talk radio, wherever, especially growing up. And it's something that even to this day, to some degree, if I'm being completely honest with you, I struggle with. Some of those thoughts still pop into the back of my head because it was something that was ingrained into us, into me, for such a long period of time. And when it comes to the issue of sex, you had for a long time, if you were gay, you were mocked publicly, you were shamed, and you were belittled to the point to where it was abusive. Now, being a Christian man, I don't think we should be celebrating any of the LGBT aspects, any of them. But do I think that these people should be mistreated simply based on their sexual identity? No, I do not. But these two issues have historically been an area that they can always find sympathy because of the treatment throughout our past.
And they thought that they could really just shift the debate and win on these grounds. And so in a sense, they're complementary. They can play 3-card Monty with these two ideas. But I think there's also a deeper nexus or connection between the two. students at the elementary school level, high school level, they can be shamed. They can be told that their racial category, let's say, for example, white students are told that they have white privilege, white fragility, unconscious white racial superiority. They're part of the systemically racist society by virtue of their ancestry. But that doesn't really, in some ways, help tremendously. You can't change your race. They can't do anything about it at the level of their own identity. But these sexual identities offer an escape from the guilt and shame that was instilled on the critical race theory narrative. And they offer an escape. So you get, in some cases, I talk to teachers that say, 40% of my white female students in middle school now identify as non-binary, queer, transgender, etc. And so it gives them an avenue for participation, not just at the level of ideology, but the deeper level of identity. And so in some ways, critical race theory serves to push people into some of these constructs as an avenue out. And I think that we're seeing that in many places. And in some ways, it's actually been a harder debate to win. I think that with CRT, we had a very successful debate. And I think that with gender, and I'd be curious to hear your perspective, and sexuality, we're still in a very kind of amorphous situation where it's not quite clear which side is winning. It's not quite clear. Both of those apply,
Right.
but it's not quite clear. Where this debate is heading. I think there's a stalemate in some sense.
I'll use an example. I had a friend of mine who talked about, and I think he's German or Czechoslovakian or something along those lines. He is about as European as you can get. And his son went to a very woke high school, middle school. And he was telling me how his son one time came home and wanted to do a DNA test. Yeah, like one of those 23andMe or Ancestry.com. He wanted to have his DNA tested so he could see if he had any diversity in his background. But when it was all said and done, everything was from Europe and European, and there was nothing there. There was no Native American, there was no Black, there was no Asian or Middle Eastern, anything like that. And his son was really disappointed, which I think is really silly and really sad. Evil is not bound by skin color or ethnic origin or any of that mess. But the point that was really fascinating that Chris Rufo made was how a young person who would be manipulated or pushed by peer pressure and felt to be the outcast, the enemy, could latch on to something like gender identity. They could latch on to one of the sexual categories, whether it be trans or gay or bi or whatever it is. They can latch on to one of those identities. And then they feel as if they can participate, or they're also a part of the marginalized. Then they're one of the crowd. They're not part of the oppressor group. And man, just him pointing that out as he referenced how there's some schools that say like 40% of their females identify as non-binary or trans or whatever. And I think it's a coping mechanism that these young people have. They're seeking to fit in. Truly, truly unfortunate. Do you think he made a legit case for why that is? Those of us that are Christians, we understand that there's a deeper foundation. We understand the nature of mankind is to sin and how young people are so easily manipulated. So we know at the base, at its very foundation, that's the issue. But when we just talk about the ability to influence and try to manipulate a culture, especially a young culture, how easily something like this, how powerful something like this can be. But I'd love to know your thoughts. But before you go, make sure you check out this video right here. I think you'll find it very helpful as well.